Welcome to Crazy HOA Moments. The board picked the wrong week to play games. Welcome. Settle in, because this one gets messy fast. Virginia pointed at an ADA ramp cutout and screamed that I was blocking access and she would say it in writing. "This is your last chance to comply," she said, phone on speaker held high like it was dispatch. I looked at the curb. My rear tire sat 6 inches past the painted stripe that ended the ramp zone. The ramp itself curved toward the sidewalk 10 feet behind me. No wheelchair could roll through that space anyway because a metal post stood in the middle of the cutout. I said, "That is not blocking anything." She said, "You can be mad, or you can be compliant." The tow driver climbed out of his truck and walked toward my car with a clipboard. I said, "Wait, I am right here. I can move it." Virginia said, "Too late. The order is logged." I live in Coral Springs, Florida, in a community called the Commons at Maplewood Estates Association. I work customer service supervision, which means I record every call legally and I know how to stay calm when someone is lying to my face. Virginia Young is the architectural committee chair, and she has been gunning for me since the day I asked why guest parking required a 48-hour advance request. She said, "I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." I did not know what that meant until today. The driver pulled the lever and the wheel lift started rising. I shouted, "Stop, I am standing right here." He said, "Lady called it in, says you refused compliance." I said, "I did not refuse anything, I just got here." Virginia said, "You were notified by email this morning." I said, "I checked my email an hour ago, there was nothing." She pulled out her phone, tapped twice, then showed me a screen. I could not read the text from that angle, but she said, "Sent at 6:42. I said, "Show me the actual message." She turned the phone away and said, "I do not have to prove anything to you. The record stands." The driver hooked the chain under my rear axle. I said, "This is my car. I am telling you to stop." He said, "Talk to her. I just do what the work order says." Virginia said, "The work order is valid, and if you interfere, that is obstruction." I stepped back. My rear wheels lifted off the pavement. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Virginia saw it and said, "Recording me without consent is illegal." I said, "Florida is a two-party state for phone calls, but this is a public space and you are acting in an official capacity." She said, "You can record all you want, it will not change the violation." I kept the camera on her face and said, "What violation exactly?" She said, "Blocking access to an ADA compliance zone as defined in Covenant Section 12-4. I said, "Read me that section." She said, "I do not have to read you anything, it is in the rulebook." I said, "I have the rulebook, and Section 12-4 is about landscaping." She blinked twice, then said, "You are thinking of the old revision, this is the updated covenant." I said, "When was it updated?" She said, "Board vote, last quarter." I said, "Was it ratified by membership?" She said, "It does not require ratification. The board has enforcement authority under the master declaration." The tow driver lowered the dolly wheels and locked them. My car sat at an angle now, rear end hoisted, front tires still touching the ground. He said, "Where do you want it?" Virginia said, "Impound lot, standard hold." I said, "What is the fee?" She said, "Tow is $200, impound is $60 per day, release is another $120. I said, "I am not paying that." She said, "Then your car stays there until you do." A maintenance worker in a reflective vest stood near the fence line, watching. I made eye contact with him. He looked away. Virginia said, "Do you have anything else to say?" I said, "Yes. I am going to file a dispute, and I am going to request the email timestamp from the server, and if it does not match what you just told me, this is harassment." She smiled and said, "You can file whatever you want. The process takes 30 days and your car will be in impound the whole time unless you pay." I said, "That is extortion." She said, "That is policy." The driver climbed into his truck. I said, "Wait, can I at least get my registration out of the glove box?" He looked at Virginia. She said, "No. Once the vehicle is secured, access is restricted." I said, "That is my property." She said, "And it will be returned to you when you pay the fees." The truck started rolling forward. My car rolled with it, front tires dragging slightly. I said, "This is insane." Virginia said, "This is compliance." She jingled a key ring with too many keys on it. I do not know why that detail stuck with me, but every time she moved her hand, the keys rattled like a little bell of authority. I said, "I need that registration." She said, "You will get it when you pay." I said, "I am not paying for a tow I did not authorize." She said, "You authorized it the moment you parked illegally." I said, "I did not park illegally." She said, "The tow company determined otherwise." I said, "The tow company works for the HOA." She said, "The tow company works under contract, and their determination is binding per covenant section 18-9. I said, "Show me that section." She said, "It is in the enforcement addendum." I said, "I do not have an enforcement addendum." She said, "It was distributed in the welcome packet." I said, "I moved in 8 months ago and I never got a welcome packet." She said, "That is not my problem." I said, "It is your problem if you are enforcing rules I was never given." She said, "Ignorance is not an excuse." The truck turned the corner and disappeared behind the clubhouse. I looked at my phone. The recording was still running. I had her saying the email was sent at 6:42, I had her refusing to show me the covenant section, and I had her admitting the determination was made by a contracted vendor. I said, "I am going to the management office." She said, "They are closed." I said, "It is 3 in the afternoon." She said, "They are closed to walk-ins. You need an appointment." I said, "Fine. I will call." She said, "Good luck." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "They do not take calls after 2. I looked at the time on my phone. It was 3:12. I said, "That is convenient." She said, "That is office hours." I said, "Then I will email." She said, "Responses take 5 to 7 business days." I said, "I need my car today." She said, "Then pay the fees." I said, "I am not paying fees for an illegal tow." She said, "The tow was legal, and if you keep calling it illegal, that is slander." I said, "Slander requires a false statement." She said, "Exactly." I said, "So you are admitting the tow was legal?" She said, "I just told you it was." I said, "Then show me the documentation." She said, "I do not have to show you anything." I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. I had something bigger than her fake email timestamp. I had a city clerk confirmation that the HOA misrepresented an ordinance in writing, and I was not showing that card until the moment it would hurt the most. Virginia said, "You can stand here all day, but your car is gone and the meter is running." I said, "What meter?" She said, "Impound fees accrue daily." I said, "I have not even been notified in writing." She said, "You were notified by email." I said, "Show me the email." She said, "I already did." I said, "You showed me a screen for 2 seconds." She said, "That is all you get." I said, "That is not documentation." She said, "It is enough for enforcement." I said, "Who decides that?" She said, "I do." I said, "That is not how rules work." She said, "It is how rules work here." I jingled her keys again, and I realized she was doing it on purpose. Every time I pushed back, she jingled them, like she was reminding me she had access and I did not. I said, "I am going to get a lawyer." She said, "Go ahead. By the time you find one, your fees will be over $1,000, and good luck finding someone who will take an HOA case for less than $5,000. I said, "I will represent myself." She said, "You will lose." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I have been doing this for 6 years, and no one wins against the board." I said, "Someone will eventually." She said, "Not you." If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmare stories. I walked to my townhouse. It is a 2-story unit at the back of the complex, near the retention pond. I bought it because the price was good and I thought a quiet neighborhood would be a nice change after years of apartment living. I did not realize the Commons at Maplewood Estates Association was a place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs. The covenants are 60 pages long and half of them reference addendums that are not included in the digital file. When I asked the management company for a complete copy, they said they would mail it, but it never came. When I followed up, they said they already sent it and I must have lost it. That was 3 months ago. I have been trying to get a full rulebook ever since, because every time I do something normal, Virginia finds a rule I have never heard of. Last month she fined me for hanging a bird feeder because it was an unapproved exterior alteration. The month before that, she sent a violation notice for pressure washing my driveway without filing a maintenance request. I took the bird feeder down. I did not pressure wash anything after that. I thought if I kept my head down, she would move on to someone else. I was wrong. I sat on my couch and opened my laptop. I pulled up my email. The most recent message from the HOA was from 4 days ago, a reminder about trash pickup schedules. Nothing about parking, nothing about violations, nothing about towing. I checked my spam folder. Nothing. I checked my trash folder. Nothing. I opened my phone and checked the email there in case it was delayed. Still nothing. I called the management company. The phone rang twice, then an automated message said, "Our office is currently closed. Office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 to 2. For after-hours emergencies, press 1. I pressed 1. Another automated message said, "If this is a life-threatening emergency, hang up and dial 911. For all other issues, please leave a message and we will return your call within 2 business days." I hung up. I called the tow company. A man answered and said, "Prestige Towing." I said, "You just towed my car from the Commons at Maplewood Estates and I need to know what the violation was." He said, "Hold on." I heard clicking, then he said, "Says here blocking ADA access, authorized by property management." I said, "Who authorized it?" He said, "Work order came from Virginia Young." I said, "What time?" He said, "Dispatch logged it at 2:58. I said, "What time was the email sent?" He said, "I do not have that information." I said, "The HOA rep told me I was notified at 6:42 this morning." He said, "I just do the tows, man." I said, "Can I get my car back?" He said, "You need a release from the property manager." I said, "The property manager is closed." He said, "Then you will have to wait until they open." I said, "When is that?" He said, "Monday." I said, "Today is Friday." He said, "Correct." I said, "So my car is stuck there for 3 days?" He said, "Unless you get a release." I said, "How do I get a release if the office is closed?" He said, "I do not know, man. That is between you and them." I hung up. I opened the HOA covenant file on my laptop. I scrolled to Section 12. Section 12-1 was about front yard landscaping. Section 12-2 was about irrigation. Section 12-3 was about tree removal. Section 12-4 was about mulch standards. Nothing about ADA access. I kept scrolling. Section 13 was about architectural modifications. Section 14 was about leasing restrictions. Section 15 was about pets. Section 16 was about noise. Section 17 was about trash. Section 18 was about parking. I read Section 18. Subsection 1 said all vehicles must display a valid parking permit. Subsection 2 said guest parking requires advance notice. Subsection 3 said no parking in fire lanes. Subsection 4 said no parking on grass. Subsection 5 said no overnight street parking. Subsection 6 said vehicles blocking access may be towed at owner expense. I read that line again. Vehicles blocking access may be towed at owner expense. It did not define what blocking access meant. It did not reference ADA zones. It did not specify who determines if access is blocked. I kept reading. Subsection 7 said the board or its designee may authorize towing for any violation of these parking rules. Subsection 8 said towing fees are the responsibility of the vehicle owner. Subsection 9 said the vehicle owner may appeal a tow within 30 days by submitting a written request to the board. I closed the laptop. I had just read the entire parking section, and nowhere did it mention ADA ramp cutouts. Virginia lied. She made up a rule and enforced it with a tow truck, and now my car was sitting in an impound lot racking up fees because I could not get a release until Monday. I had a closing appointment on Tuesday. I am refinancing my mortgage to get a lower rate, and if this tow goes on my record or if a lien gets filed, the whole deal could fall apart. That was the stakes. I could not let this ride. I texted my neighbor, Marcus. He is a board member, not on the architectural committee, but on the budget committee, and he has been quietly sympathetic every time I have complained about Virginia. I wrote, "They just towed my car. Virginia said I was blocking an ADA ramp, but I was not. Do you know anything about this?" He replied 3 minutes later, "I do not, but I will ask around. Be careful." She has been talking about enforcement escalation. I wrote back, what does that mean? He wrote, she wants the board to approve stricter penalties for repeat violations. She is trying to build a case that owners are ignoring the rules. I wrote, I am not a repeat violator. This is the first time I have even been accused of a parking issue. He wrote, she is counting the bird feeder and the driveway thing. I wrote, those were not parking issues. He wrote, she is grouping them under non-compliance. I am sorry, man, I will see what I can do. I wrote, can you get me a release before Monday? He wrote, I do not have that authority. Only the manager or Virginia can issue a release. I wrote, she is the one who called the tow. He wrote, I know. I wrote, so I am stuck. He wrote, for now. Hang in there. I hung in there. I made a sandwich. I ate it. I paced around my living room, and I tried to figure out my next move. I could not call the management company until Monday. I could not get a release until Monday. My car would sit in impound all weekend, and by Monday morning I would owe at least $380. I did not have $380 to throw away on a bogus tow. I am not broke, but I am not flush either. I budget carefully, and an unexpected $400 hit would wipe out my cushion for the month. I needed to fight this, but I needed leverage. That is when I remembered the city clerk. 2 weeks ago, I went to the Coral Springs city office because Virginia had sent me a violation notice claiming my front walkway lighting was not compliant with a city ordinance. She cited Ordinance 47-12, subsection C. I looked it up. Ordinance 47-12, subsection C, is about commercial lighting for businesses, not residential walkway lights. I printed the ordinance and took it to the city clerk. The clerk confirmed it. She said, this ordinance does not apply to residential properties. I asked her to put that in writing. She printed a one-page letter on city letterhead that said, Ordinance 47-12, subsection C, applies only to commercial properties and does not regulate residential exterior lighting. I took that letter home and emailed it to Virginia. She never responded, and the violation notice disappeared from my account. I had that letter in my filing cabinet. It was my proof that Virginia had misrepresented a city rule in writing. If she did it once, she could be doing it again. I pulled the letter out and scanned it with my phone. I saved it to my cloud drive. Then I went back to the covenant file and started looking for every reference to city ordinances. I found 3. One in Section 9 about fence heights. One in Section 12 about tree trimming. One in Section 18 about fire lane markings. I wrote down all 3 references. Then I opened the city website and started searching for the actual ordinances. The fence height reference checked out. The tree trimming reference checked out. The fire lane reference did not exist. The ordinance number Virginia cited in the covenant did not appear anywhere in the city code. I searched variations. I searched archived versions. Nothing. She made it up. I printed everything. I printed the city clerk letter. I printed the covenant section 18. I printed the city code search results showing no matching ordinance. I clipped them together in a stack. Then I pulled out my phone and went through my photos. I had taken pictures the day I moved in. I had pictures of the parking lot, the guest spaces, the fire lane markings, the signage. I scrolled through them and found one from 6 months ago that showed the same ADA ramp cutout where Virginia claimed I was blocking access. In the photo, a landscaping truck was parked in the exact spot where I had parked today, rear bumper past the painted stripe, and there was no ticket on the windshield, no tow truck in sight. I printed that photo and added it to the stack. I had my evidence. I had proof that the fire lane ordinance was fake. I had proof that Virginia misrepresented city rules in writing before. I had proof that other vehicles had parked in the same spot without enforcement. I did not have the email timestamp yet, but I would get it. I just needed access to the HOA email server, and I knew the management company kept records. I also knew that if I walked into the management office on Monday and dumped all of this on the desk, they would stall and deflect and tell me to file a formal complaint. I needed a bigger stage. I needed witnesses. I needed to make this public enough that they could not ignore it. That meant a board meeting. The next board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. I checked the HOA website. The agenda was already posted. It included a budget review, a landscape proposal, and a discussion of enforcement policies. Perfect. Enforcement policies meant Virginia would be there, and she would have to answer questions in front of the full board and any owners who showed up. I looked at the attendance rules. Any owner could attend and speak during the open comment period. I did not need to be on the agenda. I just needed to show up. I saved the meeting notice and added it to my calendar. Then I texted Marcus. I wrote, "I am coming to the Thursday meeting. I am going to bring evidence that Virginia is enforcing fake rules." He wrote back, "Be careful. She will try to shut you down." I wrote, "Let her try." He wrote, "I mean it. She has done this before. Last year, a guy tried to challenge a fine and she had him removed for being disruptive." I wrote, "Was he being disruptive?" He wrote, "He raised his voice." I wrote, "I will not raise my voice." He wrote, "Good luck." I spent the rest of Friday evening rehearsing what I would say. I wrote notes. I timed myself. I practiced keeping my tone calm and factual. I knew if I came in angry, Virginia would use that against me. She would frame me as the problem, the hostile owner who could not follow simple rules. I needed to be the opposite. I needed to be the reasonable guy who did his homework and found a pattern of misconduct. I needed to let the evidence speak for itself. Saturday morning, I called the tow yard. I asked if I could at least get my registration and insurance card out of the glove box. The woman on the phone said, "No access until you pay the release fee." I said, "I need those documents to drive." She said, "Then pay the release fee." I said, "I am disputing the tow." She said, "Dispute it all you want. We do not release vehicles without payment." I said, "Can I pay just the release fee and not the impound fees?" She said, "No. It is a package." I said, "How much is it now?" She said, "Tow was $200. Impound is $60 per day. Release is $120. You are at day 2, so that is $200 plus $120 plus $120, total $440. I said, "It has only been 1 day. She said, "We count the day of the tow as day 1. I said, "That is not how days work." She said, "That is how our billing works." I said, "Fine. I will pay it when I get the car." She said, "You have to pay it before we release the car." I said, "I do not have $440 in cash." She said, "We take cards." I said, "I am not paying until I know the tow was legal." She said, "Then your car stays here." I hung up. I spent Saturday researching Florida towing laws. I found a statute that says a tow company must provide written notice of the tow within 24 hours if the vehicle owner was not present at the time of the tow. I also found a statute that says if the tow was authorized by a property manager or HOA, the authorization must be in writing and must specify the violation. I did not have written notice. I did not have a written authorization. I had a tow truck that showed up and a woman with a phone who said I was blocking access. That was it. I took screenshots of the statutes and added them to my file. Sunday, I checked my email again. Still nothing from the HOA. I called the tow yard again and asked if they had received written authorization from Virginia. The man who answered said, "I do not have access to that. You need to talk to dispatch." I said, "Can you transfer me?" He said, "Dispatch is not here on weekends." I said, "When will they be there?" He said, "Monday." I hung up. My phone battery was at 30%. I had been recording, checking emails, taking screenshots, and making calls non-stop since Friday, and I had not been near a charger for hours. I plugged it in and made a mental note to keep it charged. I could not afford to lose power at the wrong moment. Monday morning, I woke up at 7 and called the management office at 9 sharp. A woman answered and said, "Commons Management. How can I help you?" I said my car was towed on Friday, and I need a release. She said, "What is your address?" I gave her my address. She said, "Hold on." I heard typing. Then she said, "I see a tow authorization here from Virginia Young." She said, "You were blocking ADA access." I said, "I was not blocking anything." She said, "The authorization says you were." I said, "Can I see the authorization?" She said, "It is in our system." I said, "Can you email it to me?" She said, "We do not email internal documents." I said, "It is about my property. I have a right to see it." She said, "You can request a copy by filling out a records request form." I said, "How do I get that form?" She said, "It is on the website." I said, "I looked on the website. I did not see it." She said, "It is under owner resources." I said, "Can you just email me the form?" She said, "I can mail it." I said, "That will take a week." She said, That is the process. I said, this is insane. She said, I am sorry you feel that way. I said, I need a release today. She said, I cannot issue a release without board approval. I said, who on the board can approve it? She said, the president or the property manager. I said, who is the property manager? She said, that would be me. I said, so you can approve it. She said, I can, but I will not without documentation that the violation was resolved. I said, there is no violation to resolve. The tow was illegal. She said, according to our records, it was valid. I said, your records are wrong. She said, you can appeal at the next board meeting. I said, the meeting is Thursday. She said, correct. I said, my car is racking up fees. She said, you should have complied with the rules. I hung up. I got in my backup car. I keep an old sedan in the second parking space at my townhouse, a beater I bought for $500 in case something like this ever happened. I drove to the gas station 2 blocks from the HOA entrance. I needed gas, and I needed a minute to think. I pulled up to the pump and got out. I swiped my card and started filling the tank. That is when Virginia showed up. She pulled into the spot across from me, got out, and walked straight toward me. She had her phone in one hand and her key ring in the other. She said, you are not allowed to park that car in the community. I said, it is registered to my address. She said, it does not have a valid decal. I said, I never got a decal. She said, decals are mandatory. You were told that in the welcome packet. I said, I never got a welcome packet. She said, that is your problem, not mine. She held her phone up like she was about to take a picture. I said, what are you doing? She said, documenting another violation. I said, I am not in the community. I am at a gas station. She said, you were in the community 10 minutes ago. I said, how do you know? She said, I drove past your unit and saw the car. I said, so you followed me? She said, I did not follow you. I happened to be going the same direction. I said, that is following. She said, that is coincidence. I said, you are harassing me. She said, I am enforcing the rules. I said, you are inventing the rules. She said, if you do not get a decal by end of business today, that car will be towed too. I said, I cannot get a decal if the office does not give me one. She said, you can pick one up at the clubhouse. I said, I tried. They said I had to request it in writing. She said, then request it in writing. I said I did, 3 months ago. She said, then request it again. The gas pump clicked off. I pulled the nozzle out and hung it up. Virginia stepped closer. She said, you are making this harder than it needs to be. I said, you towed my car for a fake violation. She said, the violation was real and you were notified. I said, show me the email. She said, I already showed you. I said, you showed me a screen for 2 seconds. She said, that is all you get. I said, that is not proof. She said, it is enough for enforcement. I said, not if the timestamp is fake. She said, are you accusing me of falsifying records? I said, I am saying the email does not exist. She said, it exists. And if you keep slandering me, I will file a complaint with the board. I said, file whatever you want. I will see you Thursday. She said, you are not on the agenda. I said, I do not need to be. There is an open comment period. She said, the comment period is for issues related to the agenda. I said, the agenda includes enforcement policies. She said, that does not mean you get to air personal grievances. I said, it is not personal. It is about HOA enforcement practices. She said, it is personal if you are targeting me. I said, I am not targeting you. I am targeting the fake rules you are enforcing. She stepped even closer, and I could see her jaw tighten. She said, you can be mad, or you can be compliant. I said, I can be both. She said, no, you cannot. I said, watch me. She turned and walked back to her car. She got in, slammed the door, and drove off. I stood there for a minute, breathing. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. He wrote, Virginia just called me. She said you ambushed her at a gas station. I wrote back, I did not ambush anyone. She followed me. He wrote, be careful. She is building a case that you are hostile. I wrote, let her build whatever she wants. He wrote, I am serious. If she frames you as a threat, the board can issue a restraining order under the Community Safety Clause. I wrote, for what? Talking to her at a gas station? He wrote, for creating a hostile environment. I wrote, she is the one creating a hostile environment. He wrote, I know. Just be smart. I wrote, I am being smart. I have evidence. He wrote, evidence does not matter if you get removed before you can present it. I drove back to my townhouse. I parked the beater in the second space and went inside. I pulled up the HOA website and looked at the Community Safety Clause Marcus mentioned. It was in Section 22 of the covenants. It said the board may issue temporary restrictions on an owner's access to common areas if the owner's conduct creates a reasonable fear of harm or disruption. It did not define what reasonable fear meant. It did not specify what kind of conduct qualified. It was a blank check. I read it 3 times and realized Virginia could use it to ban me from the Thursday meeting if she convinced the board I was dangerous. I needed to make sure that did not happen. I needed a witness. I needed someone who could testify that I was calm, respectful, and non-threatening, and that Virginia was the aggressor. I texted the maintenance worker I had seen on Friday. I did not have his number, but I knew his name was printed on his vest. I had seen it in the corner of one of my photos. I zoomed in. His name was Luis. I looked up the maintenance company on the HOA website. It was a local contractor called Precision Grounds. I called them. A woman answered and said, Precision Grounds. I said, I am trying to reach Luis. He works at the Commons at Maplewood Estates. She said, what is this regarding? I said, I need to ask him about something he witnessed last Friday. She said, hold on. I heard a transfer tone. Then a man answered. He said, this is Luis. I said, hi, my name is David. I live at the Commons. You were near the fence line on Friday when my car got towed. He said, yeah, I remember. I said, I need to ask you something. He said, okay. I said, did you see the whole thing? He said, most of it. I said, did I do anything threatening or aggressive? He said, no. You just stood there and asked questions. I said, did Virginia do anything that seemed out of line? He paused, then said, man, I do not want to get in the middle of this. I said, I understand, but I am going to a board meeting on Thursday and I might need someone to back me up. He said, I do not think I can do that. I said, why not? He said, because she is the one who approves our contract, and if I say something she does not like, we lose the account. I said, so you are scared of her? He said, I am not scared, I just do not want problems. I said, I get it. If you change your mind, here is my number. I gave him my number. He said, I will think about it. I said, thank you. He hung up. I looked at my phone. The battery was at 18%. I had been on calls all morning, and I forgot to plug it in again. I found my charger and plugged it in. Then I sat down and made a list. I needed to do 3 things before Thursday. 1. I needed to get the email server records from the management company. 2. I needed to confirm the city ordinance misrepresentation with the city clerk again and get a second copy of the letter in case the first one got challenged. 3. I needed to prepare a 2-minute statement for the open comment period that covered everything without sounding like a rant. I started with the email records. I called the management office again. The same woman answered. I said I need to request the email server logs for Friday morning, specifically any email sent to my address from Virginia Young. She said, that requires a formal records request. I said, I know, can you send me the form? She said, I can mail it. I said, can you email it instead? She said, we prefer to mail. I said, why? She said, it is more secure. I said, email is secure. She said, not according to our policy. I said, your policy is designed to delay requests. She said, "Our policy is designed to protect owner privacy." I said, "I am requesting my own records." She said, "It still requires a formal process." I said, "Fine, mail the form." She said, "It will go out today." I said, "When will I get it?" She said, 3 to 5 business days. I said, "The meeting is in 3 days." She said, "You should have requested it sooner." I hung up. I drove to the city clerk office. It was a small building near the library. I walked in and asked for the clerk who helped me 2 weeks ago. The woman at the desk said, "She is out today. Can someone else help you?" I said, "I need another copy of a letter she gave me confirming that a city ordinance does not apply to residential properties." The woman said, "Do you have the original letter?" I said, "I have a scan on my phone." She said, "Can you forward it to me?" I forwarded it. She looked at it and said, "Okay, I can reprint this." She printed a fresh copy on city letterhead and handed it to me. I said, "Can you also confirm that Ordinance 47-12 subsection C does not apply to residential walkway lighting?" She said, "Correct. That ordinance is for commercial properties only." I said, "Can you put that in writing again?" She said, "I just did. That is what the letter says." I said, "I need it dated today." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I am presenting it as evidence on Thursday and I need it to be current." She said, "The information has not changed." I said, "I know, but I need a current date." She sighed, then reprinted the letter with today's date and handed it to me. I said, "Thank you." She said, "No problem." I said, "One more thing. Is there a city ordinance about fire lane markings in HOA communities?" She said, "Let me check." She typed on her computer, then said, "Yes, Ordinance 61-8 covers fire lane standards." I said, "Does it specify how fire lanes must be marked?" She said, "Yes, it requires red curb paint and signage indicating no parking." I said, "What if an HOA claims a fire lane exists, but there is no red curb and no signage?" She said, "Then it is not a legal fire lane under city code." I said, "Can you put that in writing?" She said, "I can, but it will take a few days to draft." I said, "I need it by Thursday." She said, "I cannot guarantee that." I said, "Can you at least email me the ordinance text?" She said, "I can do that." I gave her my email address. She said, "I will send it this afternoon." I drove back to my townhouse. I checked my email every 10 minutes. At 4 in the afternoon, the ordinance text came through. I read it. It was exactly what the clerk said. Fire lanes must have red curb paint and signage. If there is no red curb and no signage, the area is not a fire lane under city code. I printed it and added it to my stack. Then I opened the photos on my phone and found the pictures I took of the parking lot. In every photo, the curb near the ADA ramp cutout was gray. There was no red paint. There was no signage. The only marking was a faded blue stripe that indicated a handicapped space about 15 feet away. Virginia had called it a fire lane, but under city code it was not. She lied again. I had her. I spent Tuesday writing my statement. I kept it under 2 minutes. I practiced it in front of a mirror. I practiced it in my car. I timed it. It came out to 1 minute 53 seconds. I was ready. Wednesday morning, I got a text from Marcus. He wrote, "Virginia is telling people you threatened her at the gas station." I wrote, "I did not threaten anyone." He wrote, "She is saying you followed her and cornered her." I wrote, "She followed me." He wrote, "Do you have proof?" I wrote, "I have the gas station timestamp on my receipt." He wrote, "Good, bring it." I wrote, "I will." He wrote, "Also, she is trying to get you removed from the comment period." She sent an email to the board saying you are creating a hostile environment. I wrote, "Can she do that?" He wrote, "The board has to vote on it." I wrote, "When?" He wrote, "Thursday, right before the meeting starts." I wrote, "So they can ban me before I even speak?" He wrote, "Theoretically." I wrote, "That is insane." He wrote, "Welcome to the Commons." Thursday came. I put on a clean polo shirt. I grabbed my stack of documents. I grabbed my phone and made sure it was fully charged. I drove to the clubhouse at 6:30. The meeting started at 7. I walked into the meeting room. It was a small room with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table at the front. 5 board members sat at the table. Virginia was one of them. Marcus was another. The property manager sat at the end with a laptop. About a dozen owners sat in the audience. I took a seat in the back row. Virginia saw me and leaned over to whisper to the board member next to her. That board member nodded. The meeting started. The president, a man in his 60s with a gray beard, called the meeting to order. He said, "Before we begin, we have a procedural matter. Virginia has requested that we suspend the open comment period for one specific owner due to safety concerns." I felt my stomach drop. The president said, "Virginia, can you explain?" Virginia stood and said, "David Parker has engaged in a pattern of harassment and intimidation over the past week. On Monday, he followed me to a gas station and verbally accosted me in a public place. He has made baseless accusations against me in text messages and phone calls to other board members. He has repeatedly ignored direct instructions from HOA leadership. I believe his presence at this meeting poses a risk of disruption, and I am requesting that he be barred from the comment period and escorted from the premises if he refuses to comply." I stood up. I said, "That is not true." The president said, "Please sit down, this is not your turn to speak." I said, "She just accused me of harassment, I have a right to respond." The president said, "You will have a chance to respond if the board decides to hear from you. Sit down." I sat down. Marcus raised his hand. He said, "I would like to hear from David before we vote." Virginia said, "This is not a debate, this is a safety issue." Marcus said, "If it is a safety issue, we should have evidence. Do you have any evidence that David poses a threat?" Virginia held up her phone. She said, "I have a recording of him confronting me at the gas station." Marcus said, "Can we hear it?" Virginia said, "I do not think that is necessary." The president said, "If you are asking us to remove an owner from the meeting, we need to hear the recording." Virginia looked annoyed, but she tapped her phone and held it up. The recording played. It was tinny and hard to hear, but I recognized my voice. I heard myself say, "You towed my car for a fake violation." Then I heard Virginia say, "The violation was real, and you were notified." Then I heard myself say, "Show me the email." The recording cut off. Virginia said, "As you can hear, he was aggressive and accusatory." The president said, "I did not hear anything aggressive." I heard a disagreement. Virginia said, "He followed me." The president said, "Did he threaten you?" Virginia said, "He made me feel unsafe." The president said, "That is not the same thing." Virginia said, "I am entitled to feel safe." The president said, "You are, but we cannot remove someone from a meeting based on feelings. We need evidence of a threat." Marcus said, "I move that we table this request and proceed with the regular agenda." Another board member, a woman with short gray hair, said, "I second." The president said, "All in favor of tabling the request?" 3 hands went up, including Marcus. The president said, "The request is tabled." Virginia sat down. She looked furious. The president said, "We will now proceed with the regular agenda." The meeting dragged. They reviewed the budget. They discussed a proposal to replace the pool fence. They debated whether to approve a new landscaping contract. I sat in the back and waited. Finally, after 45 minutes, the president said, "We will now open the floor for owner comments. Each speaker has 2 minutes. Please state your name and address before speaking." Virginia stood and said, "I would like to remind everyone that the comment period is for issues related to tonight's agenda. Personal grievances are not appropriate." The president said, "Noted. First speaker?" I raised my hand. The president said, "Please come forward." I walked to the front. I stood at the microphone stand they had set up. I said, "My name is David Parker. I live at Unit 73. I am here to discuss enforcement policies which are on tonight's agenda. I am specifically concerned about selective enforcement and misrepresentation of HOA rules." Virginia said, "Point of order. This is a personal grievance." The president said, "Let him speak." I said, "On Friday, my car was towed from a parking space. I was told I was blocking ADA access and violating Covenant Section 12-4. I have a copy of the covenant here. Section 12-4 is about mulch standards, not parking." Virginia said, "That is the old revision." I said, "I requested a current revision 3 months ago and never received it. The management company confirmed this morning that the revision on the website is current." Virginia said, "That is incorrect." I said, "I have an email from the manager." Virginia said, "You are lying." I pulled out my phone, opened the email, and read it aloud. The manager wrote, "The covenant posted on the owner portal is the current version as of the last board ratification in January." I looked up. I said that was Monday. Virginia said nothing. I continued. I said, "I was also told that I was blocking access to a fire lane, but the city code defines fire lanes as areas with red curb paint and signage. There is no red curb or signage in the area where I was parked. I have photos and a copy of the city ordinance." I held up my stack of documents. I said, "I also have a letter from the city clerk confirming that the HOA previously misrepresented a city ordinance in writing." Virginia stood. She said, "This is slander." I said, "Slander requires a false statement. This is documented fact." The president said, "Do you have copies for the board?" I said, "I do." I walked to the table and handed each board member a copy of my stack. Virginia grabbed hers and flipped through it. She said, "This is out of context." I said, "It is timestamped and sourced." She said, "You are twisting the rules to suit your narrative." I said, "I am reading the rules as written." She said, "You do not understand how enforcement works." I said, "I understand that enforcement requires actual rules, not made-up ordinances." She stood up fast enough that her chair scraped back. She said, "I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." I smiled. I said, "You already said that." She froze. I pulled out my phone again, opened my recording app, and played the clip from Friday. Her voice came through the speaker, clear and sharp. "I can put you on the agenda and keep you there." I stopped the playback. I said, "You said that to me on Friday, right before you called the tow truck. It is on record. You told me you would keep me on the agenda as retaliation for asking questions." The room went silent. Marcus leaned forward. He said, "Virginia, is that true?" Virginia said, "That is taken out of context." I said, "The context is that I asked why I needed to file a 48-hour advance notice for guest parking. And you said you could put me on the agenda and keep me there as punishment." Virginia said, "That is not what I meant." I said, "Then what did you mean?" She did not answer. The president said, "Virginia, did you authorize the tow on Friday?" Virginia said, "Yes." The president said, "On what grounds?" Virginia said, "Blocking ADA access." The president said, "Was the area marked as ADA access?" Virginia said, "It is adjacent to an ADA ramp." The president said, "That does not make it ADA access." Virginia said, "It is implied." The president said, "Implied is not enforceable." Marcus said, "Did you notify David in writing before calling the tow?" Virginia said, "I sent an email." Marcus said, "Can you show us the email?" Virginia said, "It is in the system." Marcus said, "Can you pull it up?" Virginia tapped her phone. She tapped again. She looked frustrated. She said, "I am having trouble finding it." Marcus said, "When did you send it?" Virginia said, "Friday morning, 6:42. Marcus said, "David, did you receive an email at 6:42? I said, "No." Marcus said, "Did you receive any email from Virginia on Friday?" I said, "No." Marcus said, "Can you show us your inbox?" I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and handed it to Marcus. He scrolled through it. He said, "There is nothing here from Friday." He handed the phone to the president. The president looked at it, then looked at Virginia. He said, "Virginia, if the email does not exist, this tow was unauthorized." Virginia said, "The email exists, he must have deleted it." I said, "I did not delete anything, and the server logs will prove it." Virginia said, "You do not have access to the server logs." I said, "I requested them on Monday." The property manager spoke up. She said, "I received that request." Virginia turned to her. She said, "Did you send them?" The manager said, "Not yet, he needs to fill out a form." I said, "You were supposed to mail me the form on Monday." The manager said, "I did." I said, "I never received it." The manager said, "I mailed it." I said, "Then mail it again and email me a copy." The president said, "This is getting off track. Let me ask a simple question. Virginia, can you produce the email you claim you sent?" Virginia said, "Yes." The president said, "When?" Virginia said, "I will have it by next week." The president said, "That is not acceptable. If you authorized a tow without proper notice, that is a violation of our own enforcement policy." Virginia sat down. She looked at her phone. She said nothing. Marcus said, I would like to make a motion. I move that we suspend all pending fines and fees against David Parker pending a full review of the tow authorization and the enforcement actions taken on Friday. The gray-haired woman said, I second. The president said, all in favor? 4 hands went up. Virginia did not raise her hand. The president said, motion carries. David, your fees are suspended. I said, thank you. The president said, we will also be conducting a review of recent enforcement actions to ensure compliance with our own policies. If anyone else has concerns about selective enforcement, please submit them in writing to the management office. The meeting continued, but I stopped listening. I had won. I walked back to my seat. Marcus caught my eye and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the parking lot. Virginia was standing by her car talking on her phone. She saw me and ended the call. She walked over. She said, you think you won? I said, I did win. She said, this is not over. I said, it is for tonight. She said, you made me look like a liar. I said, you made yourself look like a liar. She said, you are going to regret this. I said, are you threatening me? She said, I am telling you how this works. You just made an enemy of the entire board. I said, the board voted in my favor. She said, Marcus voted in your favor. The rest of them are just covering themselves. Give it a week. They will come around. I said, we will see. She got in her car and drove off. I stood there for a minute, then got in my car and drove home. I felt good. I felt like I had finally pushed back and won. Friday morning, I called the tow yard. I said, the HOA suspended my fees. I need to pick up my car. The man on the phone said, I need written authorization. I said, the board voted on it last night. He said, I need it in writing from the property manager. I called the property manager. She said, I will send the release to the tow yard today. I said, can you send it now? She said, I will send it this afternoon. I said, I need my car today. She said, you will have it today. I hung up. At 2 in the afternoon, I called the tow yard again. The man said, we got the release, you can pick up your car. I drove to the tow yard. It was a fenced lot near the highway. I walked into the office. A woman at the desk said, name? I said, David Parker. She typed on her computer, then said, your balance is 0. But I need to see your ID. I handed her my license. She made a copy, then handed me a receipt and said, your car is in Lot B, space 12. I walked out to Lot B. My car was there, dusty but undamaged. I unlocked it and got in. I checked the glove box. My registration and insurance card were still there. I started the engine and drove out. On my way back to the neighborhood, I stopped at the same gas station where Virginia had confronted me. I needed gas again. I pulled up to the pump and got out. I swiped my card and started filling the tank. That is when Virginia pulled in again. She parked in the same spot as before, got out, and walked toward me. She had a piece of paper in her hand. She said, I have your release receipt. I said, I already got my car. She said, I know. I wanted to give this to you in person. She held the paper out, but when I reached for it, she pulled it back. She said, you think you are smart. I said, I think I followed the process. She said, you embarrassed me. In front of the board. I said, you embarrassed yourself. She said, I have been on that board for 6 years. And no one has ever challenged me like this. I said, maybe someone should have. She said, you have no idea what you just started. I said, I started a process to hold the HOA accountable. She said, you started a war. I said, I did not want a war. I just wanted my car back. She said, you got your car back. And now, you are going to pay for it. I said, the fees are suspended. She said, not those fees. I said, what fees? She said, you will see. She dropped the receipt on the ground between us and walked back to her car. She got in and drove off. I picked up the receipt. It was a copy of the release form, marked paid in full, with a note at the bottom that said, owner dispute resolved per board vote. I folded it and put it in my pocket. Then I finished filling my tank and drove home. Saturday morning, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA. The envelope had the management company return address. I opened it. Inside was a violation notice. It said I was in violation of Covenant Section 19-3 for operating an unregistered vehicle on HOA property. The vehicle in question was my backup car, the beater I had been driving all week. The notice said I had 7 days to register the vehicle with the HOA and obtain a valid parking decal, or the vehicle would be towed. The fine was $250. I read it twice. Then I called Marcus. I said, I just got a violation notice for my backup car. He said, let me guess, Virginia sent it. I said, it is from the management company, but I am betting she is behind it. He said, of course she is. She is trying to recoup the fees she lost on the first tow. I said, can she do that? He said if the vehicle does not have a decal, technically yes. I said I requested a decal 3 months ago and never got it. He said request it again, in writing, and keep a copy. I said I will. He said also be ready for more, she is not going to let this go. I said I know. He said I am serious. She is already talking about calling a special meeting to revisit the enforcement policy. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means she wants to tighten the rules so she can go after you harder. I said, that is retaliation. He said, prove it. I hung up. I spent the weekend drafting a decal request letter. I included the date of my original request, the fact that I never received a response, and a demand that the decal be issued within 5 business days. I printed it, made 3 copies, and mailed one to the management company with delivery confirmation. I kept the other 2 for my records. On Monday, I got another letter. This one was a fine notice. It said I was being fined $500 for interfering with a contracted vendor during the performance of their duties. The vendor in question was the tow company. The interference was me asking the driver to stop on Friday. I called Marcus. I said they just fined me $500 for talking to the tow driver. He said, appeal it. I said, how? He said in writing, to the board, you have 30 days. I said, this is insane. He said, this is Virginia. I said, she is retaliating. He said, of course she is. I said, what can I do? He said, document everything. Keep copies. Keep timestamps. Build a timeline. And be ready for the next board meeting because she is going to come at you hard. I said, when is the next meeting? He said, 2 weeks. I said, I will be there. He said, good luck. I spent the next 2 weeks building my case. I printed every email. I printed every notice. I printed every receipt. I documented the timeline. I noted every interaction with Virginia. I noted every interaction with the management company. I kept everything in a binder with tabs. I also kept recording. Every phone call, every interaction, every conversation. I was not going to let Virginia twist the facts again. On Wednesday, I got a call from Luis, the maintenance worker. He said, hey, I have been thinking about what you said. I said, about testifying? He said, yeah. I talked to my boss, and he said if the HOA tries to retaliate, we can file a complaint with the state contractor board. So I will do it. I will testify if you need me. I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. I saw what happened. She is lying, and I do not like being part of it. I said, thank you. He said, no problem. Just let me know when and where. The next board meeting was on Thursday. I showed up early. I brought my binder. I brought Luis. I brought Marcus's text messages. I brought everything. The meeting room was more crowded this time. Word had spread. About 30 owners were there, and most of them looked curious. Virginia was already at the front table. She saw me and her jaw tightened. The president called the meeting to order. He said, tonight we have several items on the agenda, including a proposal to update our enforcement policy. Virginia has requested time to present this proposal. Virginia stood. She said thank you. Over the past few weeks, we have seen an increase in owner non-compliance. We have also seen an increase in owners challenging enforcement actions in bad faith. I believe we need to update our policies to ensure that the board has the authority to act quickly and decisively when violations occur. I am proposing 3 changes. First, all tow authorizations should be considered valid unless proven otherwise. Second, owners who dispute a tow must pay the fees up front and seek reimbursement later. Third, owners who are found to have filed a bad faith dispute will be fined $1,000. The room was silent. Marcus said, that is insane. Virginia said, that is accountability. Marcus said, that is a barrier to due process. Virginia said, Due process does not mean owners get to harass the board every time they get a parking ticket. Marcus said, it also does not mean the board gets to fine people for asking questions. The president said, let's hear from the owners. Anyone want to comment? I raised my hand. The president said, David, come forward. I walked to the microphone. I said, I am here to comment on the proposed enforcement policy, and I am also here to present new evidence that the board needs to see. Virginia said, this is not the time for personal grievances. I said, this is not a personal grievance. This is about a pattern of enforcement abuse that affects everyone in this community. I opened my binder. I said 2 weeks ago I presented evidence that Virginia Young misrepresented HOA rules and city ordinances. Tonight I am presenting evidence that she did it again. I pulled out a stack of photos. I said these are photos of the parking lot taken over the past 6 months. In each photo you can see vehicles parked in the same area where I was towed. None of those vehicles were towed. None of those owners were fined. I was the only one. I handed the photos to the president. He looked through them. He said, Virginia, can you explain this? Virginia said, those vehicles may have had permits. I said, I checked the HOA records. None of them had permits. Virginia said, you do not have access to the records. I said, I requested them under the Florida HOA record statute and the management company provided them. Virginia looked at the property manager. The manager looked uncomfortable. Marcus said, is that true? The manager said, he filed a formal request. I had to comply. Virginia said, those records are confidential. The manager said, not under state law. Marcus said, so David is right. Virginia enforced the rule selectively. Virginia said, I enforced the rule when I became aware of violations. Marcus said, you became aware of a violation the moment David asked a question you did not like. Virginia said, that is not true. I said, I have a recording of you saying you would put me on the agenda and keep me there. I already played it at the last meeting. Virginia said, that was taken out of context. I said, the context is retaliation. Virginia stood. She said, I am not going to sit here and be accused of misconduct by someone who has done nothing but cause problems since he moved in. I said, I have caused problems by asking for the rules to be applied fairly. Virginia said, you have caused problems by refusing to comply. I said, I have complied with every rule that actually exists. Virginia said, you have violated multiple covenants. I said, name one. Virginia opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked at her notes. She said, you parked illegally. I said, no, I did not. You made up a rule and called it a violation. Virginia said, I did not make up anything. I said, then show me the covenant section. She flipped through her binder. She could not find it. The president said, Virginia, if you cannot cite the rule, we cannot enforce it. Virginia said, the rule is implied. The president said, implied is not enforceable. We have been over this. Marcus said, I would like to make a motion. I move that we reject the proposed enforcement policy changes and conduct a full audit of all enforcement actions taken in the past year. The gray-haired woman said, I second. The president said, all in favor? 4 hands went up. Virginia did not raise her hand. The president said, motion carries. Virginia, you will need to provide documentation for every tow, every fine, and every violation notice issued in the past year. Virginia said, that will take weeks. The president said, then you have weeks. Get started. Virginia sat down. She looked at me. I looked back. Then I said, there is one more thing. The president said, go ahead. I said, I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. I pulled out my phone. I said 2 days ago I went to the city clerk office and asked them to confirm whether the HOA has the authority to enforce city ordinances. They said no. I also asked them to confirm whether Ordinance 47-12 subsection C applies to residential properties. They said no. I played a recording. It was the city clerk's voice, clear and professional. She said, Ordinance 47-12 subsection C applies only to commercial properties and does not regulate residential exterior lighting. The HOA does not have the authority to enforce city ordinances. If a resident believes the HOA has misrepresented a city rule, they should file a complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office. I stopped the playback. I said, I confront the management company in their lobby and make them confirm the record on camera. I have that recording too. Would you like to hear it? The president said, that one not be necessary. Virginia said, this is entrapment. I said, entrapment requires law enforcement. This is documentation. Virginia said, you are twisting everything. I said, I am quoting city officials. Virginia said nothing. The president said, I think we have heard enough. We will be conducting a full review of all enforcement actions and all communications between board members and the management company. If we find evidence of misconduct, we will take appropriate action. This meeting is adjourned. The room erupted. Owners started talking to each other. Some of them came up to me and shook my hand. One woman said, thank you for doing this. Another man said, she has been doing this to people for years. Luis walked over and said, that was intense. I said, thanks for being here. He said, no problem. Let me know if you need anything else. I said, I will. Marcus walked over. He said, you did good. I said, is it over? He said, not yet. She is going to fight this. I said, let her fight. I have everything documented. He said, I know. Just be careful. She is not going to go quietly. I said, I am not going anywhere. The next week, I got a call from the property manager. She said, the board has decided to refund your tow and immobilization fees and clear your ledger. I said, thank you. She said, we are also issuing you a parking decal. It will be mailed to you within 5 business days. I said, what about the fines? She said, all fines related to the tow incident have been waived. I said, what about Virginia? She said, that is a board matter. I cannot comment. I hung up. 2 days later, I got another call. It was Marcus. He said, you need to hear this. A board member recorded Virginia bragging about getting a cut of the tow fees. I said, what? He said, she was on a call with the tow company, and she said something about a referral bonus. One of the board members was in the room and recorded it. I said, is that legal? He said, in Florida, it is legal to record if you are part of the conversation. The board member was on a conference call, so he was part of it. I said, what happens now? He said, the board is going to vote on whether to remove her. I said, when? He said, next meeting. I said, I will be there. He said, you do not have to be. This one is on us. I said, I want to be there anyway. The next board meeting was packed. Every seat was full. Virginia was at the front table, but she looked different. She did not have her key ring. She did not have her phone out. She sat with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. The president called the meeting to order. He said, tonight we have one item on the agenda. The board has received evidence of financial misconduct involving a board member. We will be voting on whether to remove that member from the board. Virginia said, this is a witch hunt. The president said, this is a board vote. You will have a chance to respond. Virginia said, I have done nothing wrong. The president said, we have a recording of you discussing a referral bonus with the tow company. Virginia said, that was a joke. The president said, it does not sound like a joke. He played the recording. Virginia's voice came through the speaker. She said, so how does the referral bonus work? Do I get a percentage per tow or is it a flat rate? The tow company rep said, it is a flat rate, $50 per authorized tow. Virginia said, that is fair. Send me the agreement. The recording stopped. The room was silent. Virginia said, that was taken out of context. The president said, what context makes that acceptable? Virginia said, I was exploring options for cost recovery. The president said, cost recovery for whom? Virginia said, for the HOA. The president said, the referral bonus goes to you, not the HOA. Virginia said, it was going to be donated. The president said, to whom? Virginia did not answer. The president said, I am going to call for a vote. All in favor of removing Virginia Young from the board for financial misconduct? 5 hands went up. Every board member except Virginia. The president said, the motion carries. Virginia, you are removed from the board effective immediately. Please turn in your keys and any HOA property in your possession. Virginia stood. She said, this is not over. The president said, yes, it is. Virginia looked at me. I looked back. Then she walked out. The room erupted in applause. I sat in my chair and exhaled. Marcus turned around and gave me a thumbs up. I nodded. It was over. The next day, I got an email from the management company. It said the HOA was conducting a full audit of all enforcement actions taken under Virginia's authority. It also said that any owner who believed they were unfairly fined or towed could submit a reimbursement request. I forwarded the email to everyone I knew in the community. Over the next 2 weeks, 12 owners submitted requests. The board approved all of them. The total reimbursement was over $8,000. The management company quietly terminated their contract with the tow company. A new vendor was brought in with a clear policy: no tows without written notice and photographic evidence of the violation. The board also voted to update the enforcement policy to require that all rule interpretations be reviewed by an attorney before being enforced. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Marcus called me a month later. He said, "You should run for the board." I said, "I do not think I am ready for that." He said, "You just took down the most powerful person in the HOA. You are ready." I said, "Maybe next year." He said, "Fair enough." I said, "How is everything going?" He said, "Quiet. People are actually following the rules now because the rules make sense." I said, "That is all I wanted." He said, "I know. You did good." I said, "Thanks." He said, "Seriously, thank you. A lot of us were too scared to say anything. You were not." I said, "I just wanted my car back." He said, "You got a lot more than that." He was right. I got my car back. I got my fees refunded. I got Virginia removed. But more than that, I got a neighborhood where the rules actually meant something, where enforcement was not a weapon, where asking questions was not a threat. I still live at the Commons at Maplewood Estates. I still see the parking lot every day. I still see the ADA ramp cutout where this whole thing started. And every time I see it, I remember what Virginia said. You can be mad, or you can be compliant. I chose both. I appreciate you taking the time to listen.